Hi, Mr. Brian. Thank you very much for joining us today and for taking time to speaking with BTW Media. My name is Jessica from BTW Media. So you have played a significant role in earlier development of the internet, and your book, Network Geeks, offer a real insider perspective on how technical decisions, collaboration, and governance shaped what the internet became. So today we would love to explore those experiences and reflect on what they mean for the internet today. So to begin with, could you briefly introduce yourself and describe your role in the earlier development of the internet?
So my name is Brian Carpenter. I'm British, though I now live in New Zealand. I studied physics as a student and then switched to computer science. And after a while, got involved in networking because it was the next new thing in computing. That was while I was at CERN, the physics lab. And
Okay.
then I found myself running the networking group at CERN after a few years. And we just sort of naturally had no choice except to start connecting to the internet and using the internet. So that's how I got involved.
So in your book, The Network Geeks, you describe your earlier involvement in academic and research networks. So what first attracted you to networking technologies at the stage of your career?
Well, I was working at the beginning in control systems where we were controlling the accelerators, the big machines at CERN. And we were in the process of changing that from the old-fashioned sort of controls using wires and buttons to a more modern system using computers. And once you did that and you discovered you needed more than one computer, you basically had no choice. You had to build a network, right? So it was sort of a little bit accidental, but it became very interesting to me because I found this notion of computers talking to each other without needing people quite interesting, and just moved slowly into networking. And then, as I said, eventually my job became 100% networking. And since we had to connect our lab to every physics department in every university that wanted to collaborate with our lab, we had to make wide area links, long distance links, intercontinental links. And the only natural way to do that, at the beginning of the period I'm talking about, in the 1980s, was the internet. So we got into the internet a long time before most people had heard of it.
So in your book, also, one of the strongest themes in your writing is the highly collaborative culture among earlier internet engineers. So how would you characterize that culture, and what values or working practice made it so effective?
It's a complicated question, and I think you need a sociologist, not a computer scientist, to give you a good answer. But what I noticed when I first got involved, the internet already existed when we connected to it, was that it was actually just like dealing with physicists. Because physicists, they're experimental scientists. They run very large, complex experiments, and you can't do that if you can't collaborate with people. You can't do it on an international basis if you can't collaborate with people from other countries and other languages and other cultures. So to me, when I first got involved in the internet, it was just sort of natural because the internet people were doing what the physics people were doing, which was talking to each other and somehow believing in a common goal. And the common goal wasn't, theories of physics. The common goal was connecting computers together and connecting people together. And so most of the people involved, and I'm still talking about the 1980s, they were naturally collaborative. They didn't want to do their own thing. They wanted to do everybody's thing. And and that's a bit unusual. Not all human endeavor is like that. At that point, there was very little greed, very little money. Uh, Money was not the goal. The connectivity was the goal. And it was just a nice environment. Now, I have to say that's changed, but that's how it was in the late 1980s and the beginning of the 1990s.
So at some point, the internet clearly become more than just a technical system. So when did you personally begin to see the internet as a global social and political infrastructure rather than simply a network of networks?
Well, it's hard to remember because it happened slowly. You know the old story about, which is not actually scientifically correct, about boiling a frog very slowly. It will never jump out of the water. It was a little bit like that because, there was the internet and everybody connected to it was somehow involved in research and education, mainly university level education. And we were all friends with each other. And of course, there was some competition, but it was respectable competition, if you know what I mean. And this probably happened after Tim Berners-Lee had invented the web, which, by the way, was invented about 50 meters away from my office at that time, since I was still at CERN. People began to realize that you could do things on the internet now that were not just geeky technical things. You could advertise products, you could even sell products. That was a very new concept to do that on the internet, of course, in the beginning of the 1990s. But people began to notice this. And I would say I really noticed it and thought it was getting to be important about 1995. But probably I was slow, and people who had been watching more carefully would have seen it before then. But it was after that point that the motivations of some of the people involved began to change. It wasn't just about connecting people and connecting scientists and connecting educators. It began to be about connecting ordinary people, for some users at least, about making money from ordinary people. So that was a change, and that was pretty obvious by 1995.
So let's move on to the last question. So looking back, what do you consider the most important lesson for the internet's earlier development for today's engineers, like policymakers and governance institution?
Well, I think it's the same thing. It was this spirit of cooperation where you really didn't question anybody's reasons. Everybody was trying to do the same thing, which was to improve connectivity. One example is that around 1990, as you may know, there was a big change, big political change in Eastern Europe with the failure of communism in those countries and the beginnings of a more modern capitalist society in those countries. And immediately, the network expanded in the eastern direction from Western Europe, which was pretty well connected by then, to Eastern Europe. And that happened just in a year or two. And it happened, by the way, because a lot of academics in Eastern Europe had just been waiting for the opportunity. They knew what we were doing in Western Europe with the network. They wanted to do the same thing. In some countries, one example, for example, is Estonia, for example, which became very, very advanced very, very quickly in the technical area because, their academics were of high quality and had just been waiting for the chance to do this. And they did it in the same spirit of cooperation that we had been doing, in Europe and in North America for many years. And it worked very well. I think the lesson from all that is the spirit of cooperation with horizontal decision taking has always worked much better in the internet than vertical decision taking from above for political reasons or for legal reasons. Not to say there won't be some influence of the government and some influence of the law on the development of the network. That of course we live in the real world. That has to happen. But the best collaboration, the best policy making has always been the horizontal kind, where the people who really understand the technology, they'll work together to extend the technology. So I think that's my answer to that question, that the world is complicated. So It's not necessarily the answer for every country at every time, but that's the answer, I think, which is the best one.
So I think that's all my question. So thank you very much for sharing this reflection and for helping us better understand how the internet come to be. So we really appreciate your time and your contribution for our history of the internet series.
Thank you very much.